Bene, bentrovati, buon pomeriggio. Oggi siamo qui per un evento un po' speciale, un'altra diretta di appunti in inglese, quindi adesso passerò all'inglese, ma prima vi dico solo due parole su quello che andremo a discutere. Ci sarà con noi Marietje Schaake, che è stata a lungo europarlamentare e adesso è una delle voci più importanti nel dibattito sul ruolo della tecnologia e sulla politica della tecnologia. È appena uscito in italiano un suo libro che ha fatto molto discutere in inglese, che si chiama Il colpo di Stato delle Big Tech, come salvare la democrazia da Silicon Valley. Questo libro è uscito in italiano per Franco Angeli, che ci ha aiutato a organizzare questo evento. Quindi adesso do subito il benvenuto a Marietje Schaake e vi ricordo che voi potete mettere i vostri commenti, le vostre domande nella chat in maniera che poi diventino parte di questa discussione. Ok. Okay, here we are. Hi again, Marietje. Thank you for making it. It's a great honor to have you here on Appunti, our live stream of our newsletter. So your book has just came out in Italian, and I'm sure that it will become part of the conversation here as well. So I would like to start the conversation asking you to explain your long journey to come to this book. So how did you start to work on technology and its political implication, first as a politician and then as a scholar?
Well, thank you so much for having me, and it's great that the book is out in Italian, so I can hear more of the beautiful Italian language. But I'm glad we can do this in English as well, because otherwise I would struggle. I've always been curious about technology. I studied new media as a minor at the University of Amsterdam. I was following all kinds of debates because when I was in university were the first years of the World Wide Web and the popularizing of the internet. And so I was very curious about what it would mean, globalization, anti-globalization, what change would technology bring? And in my own campaign to become a member of the European Parliament, I used social media quite a bit because I was an outsider in politics. These were, the years when Barack Obama had also successfully used technology to get elected as an underdog, really, candidate in the United States as well. So at the time, technology came with a huge promise of democratization, of empowering people, of breaking through vested interests, that were going after their self-interest, not the public interest, and so on. And as a newly elected member of European Parliament, we're talking about 2009 now, I was one of the few people who was really focused on technology as a political theme. And that would quickly change because if you remember, there were the WikiLeaks
Yeah, sure.
instances, which really, pushed to the forefront the question of how does technology change power relations? What does it mean geopolitically? And then quite quickly, we also saw the popular uprisings with, Iranians taking to the streets, Tunisians, Egyptians, Syrians, and so on. And there were basically two narratives at the time. One was very prominent, which was that tech platforms, mobile phones would empower people, would send waves of democratization around the world. And the other narrative that I began to look at more closely was more hidden, was from activists that talked about their emails being compromised, their conversations being seen by state authorities. In other words, spyware, exfiltration, intimidation through technology by these authoritarian regimes. And so I began to focus on the question, what should Europe do to make sure that indeed technology is a tool and is used for democratization? And I understood that this would not be a self-fulfilling prophecy, so that we needed policy interventions and not just market forces.
Okay, that's super interesting. And it's interesting also that in your book, basically, you say that politicians with different background had the same approach to technology. So they thought that can use technology with no, how to say, with no side effects. You mentioned Barack Obama. We all remember how celebrated it was that he was so keen to use Twitter and Facebook in his campaign. And but I was more surprised that you also mentioned that Joe Biden did the same mistake, that he was too soft on technology, that there was no real breakthrough in terms of different approaches to Silicon Valley. So basically, in the last 20 years, we've seen all the US presidents who basically made a deal with the Silicon Valley approach and with their power. But what were the differences? So Barack Obama, Trump 1, Joe Biden, and Trump 2 are very different in their approach to Silicon Valley, or they are part of the same, how to say, Faustian pact in which they share power and they become puppets, basically, by the big tech complex?
Well, it's a great question. And I think it's a little bit of both, because I think there are some through lines that are very strong in the US and have been for a long time, which is, hands-off approach by governments, let market forces work it out, give the private sector a lot of agency. And that was also the approach chosen to the tech companies. And what was interesting is that the profile of some of the most, well-known tech CEOs was also one of adhering to progressive values. For example, the Obama campaign, thanks to Eric Schmidt, who we later saw as CEO of Alphabet, the company over Google, was really helping fundraising for Barack Obama in Silicon Valley, for example. And so part of the policies that we see are perhaps more uniquely American, and it doesn't matter whether it was Democrats or Republicans in charge. But of course, between Obama and Biden, the tech companies got so much bigger, so much more vertically integrated. They developed so many more functions. And so it's even if you want to achieve the same goals, you would need different policies given the changes in the market dynamics. And so, I'm a centrist in Europe. My party is liberal and progressive, but we don't typically propagate strong policy interventions. But I think, the reality that we've arrived at really demands strong policy interventions if we want to preserve a rule of law, democracy, public interest, independent oversight, accountability, and so on. And so I think you're right that Biden didn't achieve the fundamental changes that he wanted to achieve, but of course he did take more steps than previous presidents. He appointed people like Lina Khan, Jonathan Cantor, Tim Wu, strong legacy experts of antitrust understanding, including with a focus on technology, but he just didn't have the political majority. So he actually did an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal calling on Congress to support his efforts to adopt more policies, because he just couldn't decide on his own. He didn't use executive orders the way Trump does. And so I think Biden probably understood it. He was also really pushed that direction by Elizabeth Warren, one of the other candidates for the presidency that really ran on a platform of breaking big corporations and big tech. Bernie Sanders being a strong voice, challenging the Joe Bidens of this world. So I think times in policy in the Democratic Party changed. Times in the market definitely changed. But now we are where we are with Trump, which, whose administration has given more power to the tech companies, even if they were already very powerful, and has made the tech billionaires his sort of, key allies in rolling out his very anti-European, but also often anti-democratic policies. And there's even less regulation than there already was in previous presidencies.
Yeah, probably one of the problems is that all the people you mentioned, from Jonathan Cantor to Lina Khan and Tim Wu, they are all part of the same new brand Asian antitrust community. So they share the idea that you have just to limit the power of the largest corporations. While I think one of the most interesting aspects of your book is that you adopt a much broader approach. And the big tech you have in the title is not just the magnificent seven, Microsoft, Google, and so on. So if I understood correctly, you are basically saying that the technology companies that have privatized traditional state functions are much much more. I mean, the list is much longer than 7 companies, because you mentioned submarine cables, you mentioned cryptocurrency, and Palantir, like defense companies. So basically, how do you explain that this is not at the center of the conversation? It's just that these companies are so skillful that and they have very well-paid lobbyists, or it's just that there is an information asymmetry that we do not even understand what's going on. It's too complicated. So, I mean, you know it because you have spent 10 years of your life working on it, but I mean, the average citizen
Well,
has
more
no idea.
now. I mean, almost 20 years of my life. Time
Yeah,
flies,
okay.
you know.
Yeah.
But I think having such a strong economic lens, looking at abuse of power as causing economic harm, has long been the dominant view, you know, leading antitrust efforts and so on. Lina Khan tried to stretch that and say, look, privacy harms are also harms as a result of antitrust. Loss of democracy is also a harm. But I tried to kind of turn it around and say, let's look at the impact of tech, when it's under-regulated, on democracy and the rule of law much more broadly. And so that means you don't necessarily have to be a monopolist to come into the view of policies. Because if you look at spyware, for example, most spyware producers are actually quite small, or at least not as big as big tech, but they are deeply anti-democratic. And so I think they merit intervention, because having spyware impacts source protection of journalists, impacts the separation of powers, impacts the rule of law, violates privacy, and so on. So I've tried to offer a different model of looking at significant societal power rather than significant market power, to assess whether stronger requirements, more interventions, different kind of governance are needed around these tech companies. And so I try to be indeed broader and take the impact on democracy and the need for different democratic governance as the key lenses here.
Okay. No, in this sense, I'm curious about your assessment of what Elon Musk did, because in a way, it was the most extreme example of a tech corporation. I mean, kind of tech corporation, a tech guy entering from the front door at the White House, using just a tiny fraction of his money, just less than 1%, and he bought a ticket to get into the Oval Office. How do you assess this? Do you think it is like the proof that politics and politicians in a way are still in charge and they can still shape the way technology evolves, or the other way around? He's just, I mean, he made some mistakes, but he proved that if a tech mogul wants to buy the White House for his candidate and to buy for himself the equivalent of a ministry, he can do it. But Elon Musk probably is too crazy to remain committed enough time to be effective.
Well, I think Elon Musk is very, very smart, and he understood that beyond economic success, power in the political sense was something that he could leverage from the products and the services that he is either building or acquiring. So I remember well, because I was living in California at the time, when he bought Twitter and then renamed it X. Some people were laughing. They were like, oh my God, what a shitty business deal did Elon Musk get? You know, the platform was not doing very well from a profit point of view. I don't even know if it was profitable at all. And so people started to look at it from a business deal perspective. But if you look at it through the lens of what power it gave him over the public debate, you know, changes he could make to the algorithm, insights he could gain into people's political views, assistance that he could offer to nationalist far-right parties, as he has in Europe, for example, it makes more sense. Sorry. It makes more sense. And so what I do in the Tech Coup is also invite people to look through the lens of power. And yes, states are still incredibly powerful, of course, if they're willing to use the authority, the legislative power, the enforcement power, then a lot can still happen. I think China really illustrates that very well, that you can have, you know, a state that affirms and enforces its vision, in the case of China, the communist vision, while having successful companies. And that also, in a way, challenges the whole narrative that, liberal democracy brings more prosperity, because we've now seen prosperity without liberal democracy as well. On the other hand, tech CEOs themselves are very powerful. And Musk has shown this before he became the wingman of Donald Trump, when he decided that Starlink should not be made available for people on Crimea, for example, because it didn't match his own geopolitical views and assessments of the war of aggression that Russia is waging against Ukraine. And so I think both is true. CEOs of tech companies are incredibly powerful. I speak of the tech companies as the new sovereigns. And states are still very powerful, particularly the United States. I mean, I sit in the Netherlands right now. It's, not an insignificant country, but it's definitely a different actor than the United States, with all its tech power and political power. But when the two come together, and that's where we are now, we see unprecedented synergies between the already powerful billionaires and their companies and the White House and the US administration. And then you see how it adds up to a very new kind of equation, and one that we in Europe need to draw dramatic conclusions from. This is no longer the world that we used to live in. The transatlantic relation has been ended by Trump. That's really unfortunate, but it's the new reality. No time for nostalgia. We have to appreciate where this administration is, and also how it is using our tech dependence that is only growing more intense, with all of us using AI platforms and, just going along with the new shiny thing that's being thrown at us. We are going to really, lose more self-determination, lose more sovereignty, have less insight, understanding, ability to act in our own societies, less accountability. And I think that is not only economically stupid, but it's also very, very dangerous.
No, I have a final question about the US before moving to the European reaction to what's going on.
Yeah.
I mean, if you have to summarize what is at stake now, what would you say? I mean, sometimes I'm confused because it's not entirely clear to me whether, what these big tech companies want now exactly. I mean, they're extremely large, extremely profitable. They have a president that basically has a deal with them, and he's not trying to push any kind of regulation, and he's also liberalizing the crypto industry and other stuff. But these companies apparently are engaging in a tough competition in the AI industry, and they use a political argument to motivate this competition, which is national security, much more than profit. So they say, we are doing this for you because we are not trying to become richer and more powerful. We are trying to preserve American supremacy. But if you look at the political side, that American supremacy is gone and many other aspects. So the US are retrenching from their world relevance. I mean, the message of Donald Trump is, we don't care about Europe. We want to focus on ourselves and on China. So how do you see this from a political perspective? What is the real challenge now?
Well, I think there are a couple of things happening at the same time. I think companies are operating on a spectrum of, sorry, hold on, I'm a little bit under the weather.
Yeah, I have the same issue.
Yeah, talking a lot is not always helpful. So yeah. I think the companies are operating on a spectrum of maximizing their options to make profit for as long as they can, pushing a deregulatory agenda, going with the flow, getting out of the administration what they can, which is mainly what companies have done before. But now the alliance is more explicit, and I think the gamble is much greater because, of course, this is a controversial presidency for many around the world and for many in America. And so tying one's reputation and brand to it is a risk, but we can talk about it. So I think they're optimizing for short-term gains, pragmatism, and so on. And on the other end of that sort of bandwidth of what companies are doing, we see a number of investors, CEOs, crypto entrepreneurs that have very specific worldviews. And I think that they are trying to roll those out with and through the president, the vice president. So, we cannot make sense of a concept like DOGE, the so-called Department of Government Efficiency that Elon Musk was, appointed by the president to lead, but he didn't go through all the processes that a normal appointment of a normal department would go through. No hearing before Congress, no distancing with business interests. So he was given a very special position, and the narrative was, we're going to reform the government. But what we saw was, one, him obtaining excessive access to data that could have a lot of, interest for him and his AI company. And we saw a destruction of some, critical government capabilities. And that only makes sense if you understand that the vision could be not to reform, but to replace with a different model, the kind of startup nations that people talk about, led by CEO kings, a network society, a very different model where democracy is not the leading goal or set of values informing government and accountability, but where the idea is corporations are better at governing our societies. And so I think that's sort of the spectrum that companies are on. So some may just be in it to maximize their profit while they can, and others are there with a much more explicit political vision that they see room for pushing with this president and vice president.
Yeah, and I totally agree that there is also this ideological component that we have to put in the equation. Otherwise, we do not understand how these people think. But speaking about Europe, I mean, in your book, you are not catastrophic. I mean, in this moment, it's quite easy to say Europe is out of the game, while you have worked quite intensively on how Europe can shape the evolution of this industry and its impact on democracy. So I'm curious about your first assessment of the Artificial Intelligence Act. As you mentioned in the final part of your book, it was created, and I mean, the framework was created for a different world, a pre-ChatGPT world, and after that we had to catch up. So now, do you think that this is like a model, a template for future regulation in Europe, or is the new GDPR, which means like a super cumbersome European regulations that have the only effect of making innovation in Europe more difficult without having a real impact on what's going on in the Silicon Valley?
Well, let's pause because there's so much in your question. So first of all, I wrote and published the book before Trump got reelected. So a lot of the things that I warned for and hoped that we could still
they are happening.
have since materialized. And I also put a lot of responsibility in the hands of political leaders in democracies who've allowed the situation of the power of the tech companies to emerge. So it's by no means just a criticism of the tech companies, although that's obviously there, but it's also criticism of what politicians have failed to do. So I just want to make that clear. Now, fast forward to where we are today. We've talked about the role that American tech companies and the US administration plays, and now let's get to where Europe is. The EU was priding itself for being a super regulator. For the longest time, whenever there was a discussion about tech and geopolitics, so what the US does and China does, Europeans, especially those working at the European Commission, would really put forward the vision that we needed trust-based innovation, protection of fundamental rights, strengthening of the single market. And so we were entirely legitimate in regulating these companies because of, risks, harm, need to protect fairness and fundamental rights. And I, broadly agree with that vision. If you go to Brussels now, it looks like that was a different world that never existed. Within a year and a half, the narrative has changed from regulation to simplification. And that is really the idea of deregulating under a different label. And there's a lot of talk about investing and building European alternatives, but there's just not enough action to follow that through. So while I don't know anyone that doesn't want more strategic autonomy, doesn't want digital sovereignty, doesn't want a Euro stack, I think a lot of people in the business community in Europe really understand the risks of being so dependent, the loss of IP, the further weakening of our own competitive position if we use other companies' services. Our citizens understand that what's going on is not helpful. A lot of civil society organizations, every public institution is like, how can we be less dependent on foreign tech companies? But there's not that much focus by political leaders on how to operationalize it. For example, on how public procurement can be leveraged, how signals can be sent to the market, how initiatives for regulation to make a capital markets union can be launched. There's a whole lot that we kind of know that needs to happen, but it's just not operationalized enough. So if you ask me about the omnibus and the simplification, so the goal of having less bureaucracy that gets in the way of innovation and the growth of European tech companies, it sounds fine.
Mm-hmm.
But the question is, can the European Commission retain the grip so that they can use a surgical knife to make some beautiful corrections? Or is there a risk of a Pandora's box being opened? You can't just open a law a little bit and then hope everything else will be intact. I think when you open it, there's also a risk that somebody comes in with an axe and just starts hacking away at the core of the law. And so the promise of what this simplification is going to do for our innovative and competitive capabilities is huge. While I think that's an overpromise, at the same time, the announcement comes at an unfortunate moment, because it comes at a moment where we're under attack by the US for regulating. And so it risks sending the unfortunate signal that pressure works. And I think that that is really what is happening now. I think, companies, the US administration are thinking, good, we've applied pressure. We're seeing a cutting down of certain tech rules that we said we hated. Let's apply some more pressure. And the European Commission should be very careful. If you heard Commissioner Ribera today, she said that the US is blackmailing the Europeans over tech regulation as part of the trade negotiations, because they're basically saying, weaken your tech regulation first, then we can negotiate about lowering the tariffs. So the fact of the matter is, tech policy is a top priority for the US government. It is not a top priority, not in our individual states. I don't know how it is in Italy, but in the Netherlands, it doesn't even feature in the political top 10.
Well, here in Italy, we discuss about a human-centric technology, a human-centric artificial intelligence. We mentioned Leonardo da Vinci and Renaissance ideals. I mean, bullshit. I mean, we do not discuss. We're completely out of the game. I mean, at least in the Netherlands, you have ASML, so you know what a semiconductor is. Here in Italy, we discuss still about automotive industry. But so
well,
how do you explain?
Government did have some interesting discussions with Elon Musk, right? So I think Italy is in the game, but it's in a different game sometimes.
On the wrong side, maybe. I mean,
from my perspective, yes.
The Italian president, Sergio Mattarella, basically said very tough words against the interferences by Elon Musk in Italian politics, especially when he criticized Italian courts that oppose the government. So, yeah,
right.
These are very hot topics, but we do not have any serious contribution on the discussion on digital regulation. But if you have to explain why these companies are so scared about European regulation, what is the most problematic piece of legislation? Is the DMA, which means like the opening of some form of competition in the industry, or the DSA, which means the protection of users from their power of doing whatever they want with information, with data, with political opinions, and manipulating people. So what is that scares them the most?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that the attacks that the US has on European regulation are most focused on the Digital Services Act. And I think it's probably because of the transparency provisions. So the law talks about the obligations that tech platforms have to make sure that harmful content does not spread. Could be violence, could be about health crises, could be the spread of content that undermines democracy in a systematic way. So that's what people mostly know about the Digital Services Act. But there are also provisions for academics to better research the algorithms. And I think that's probably the prize that the tech companies want to protect, because once we understand better how algorithms influence our information diet, how disinformation spreads, how actors can game the algorithm, what companies are and are not doing, and what the impact has been, in those windows of time, then the scrutiny will come from all parts of society. Because frankly, digitization means privatization, and we've pretty much outsourced the curation of our information to advertising-driven companies. And so what's good for profit is not necessarily what's good for the public. And certainly what is good for US tech companies is not necessarily what's good for a healthy democratic debate. And I think this transparency that would allow for more research will actually begin to expose what has thus far remained obscure and has been a key way in which companies have a lot of discretion to decide how they want to share information, what we see, what they know about us, our collective response to this information or that information or whatnot. And I think that explains why they're much more critical of the Digital Services Act than, for example, the AI Act, which is actually interesting because the whole world is talking about AI, but the White House is more concerned about the Digital Services Act.
Yeah, that's interesting also because, one of the most insightful part that I appreciate in your book is when you describe how difficult it is for policymakers to interact with these companies, because basically you want to regulate them with almost no meaningful information about how they actually work, because they try to protect everything, not simply the algorithm, but also the kind of data they have, how they use this data. I'm always surprised when I see the numbers of PhD that Amazon employs, because there is an army of economists and computer scientists and other psychologists, maybe, I don't know, who do things for Amazon, and we do not know what they do. And so how do you think that a policymaker that is starting now the same path that you did more than a decade ago can deal with these companies to reduce this asymmetry of information? Because I see the risk that you also mentioned in the book of privatizing the supervision of private companies. So since you are not capable to compete with them, you basically hire companies that are supposed to interact with these private companies in doing monitoring and enforcement of regulation, which it's, I don't know if it is the only viable option or if it is the final surrender.
Yeah, well, you're right. And so one of the solutions I talk about is that we need to get more independent expertise into legislative bodies. So to have an independent tech set of experts, the same way we have legal service experts that can help lawmakers passing laws, because most parliamentarians have not studied law, even though they have to write law. And so that's why there's usually a legal service in every parliament, so that they can get impartial, independent information about, how to make the law legally sound, so that it doesn't get, challenged before the first court after it enters into force. So we need more independent expertise. If I were a lawmaker now, I would also double down on the preconditions for better governance, preconditions for more oversight, meaning transparency provisions, access to information provisions, accountability mechanisms, innovations in enforcement processes. Because, in the Netherlands, there's an authority that looks at competition, there's an authority that looks at data protection, and those are all very important, but they have to look at whether, a hospital is treating data properly and whether a truck company is being anti-competitive. The same that they have to look at whether a social media giant or an AI company is respecting the rules. And it just requires very different skills, capabilities, expertise. And I'm not sure that we are giving these authorities the necessary resources and that we are treating them seriously enough, including that they may need to innovate from time to time in order to be successful at enforcing the laws. The law may not change. For example, discrimination was illegal, is illegal, but where discrimination might happen is much harder to see. And if it happens algorithmically, as we see over and over again through, AI applications, then you just need a different kind of capabilities as an enforcement body. And so I would love to see more debate about how this can be realized, because if we don't have the proper enforcement, the legitimacy of any law falls from underneath it.
An additional problem that you say that policymakers should leverage experts. The problem is that very often experts are conflicted. If you are an expert in digital regulation, probably in your career you had to interact with digital companies. It may be that could create a problem because you had access to private data, or you were hired as a consultant, as an expert, blah, blah, blah. I mean, we had many issues about that. Also in Europe, I remember the case of a person that I have had the opportunity to interact with, Fiona Scott Morton, who basically was prevented to have a major role as an economist because she had worked with digital companies. So now that you have also experienced the academic world in Stanford in the US, how big is this problem? Do you think that there are enough independent experts in this field to have a proper conversation on that? Almost everybody has a conflict of interest, so we need to ask for a disclosure policy before considering someone's opinion.
Well, I think a disclosure policy makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, especially if you are acting in the public interest, then it's good to know whatever else you've done. I think a couple of things. I think the fact that Fiona Scott Morton had worked for companies does not necessarily disqualify her. A different reading is to say she knows exactly what goes on the inside. She's very, very qualified. And the fact that she's willing to take a salary cut, to move continents, to serve the public interest is actually also a plus. It's a good thing about her. Anyway, if you have different interests or different opinions, which is normal, then one way to deal with it is to just diversify so that there's equilibrium between the different opinions, because society also is full of different opinions. And so that's normal in politics. I think it's always, this is an age-old problem. If you have legal experts working, are they independent? If you have medical experts, do they have different interests? Let's begin by giving independent experts like academics more opportunities to work in government, and to really think about how we can keep and recruit people for that public interest. Because at Stanford especially, I kept seeing my students moving to the big tech companies, not because they necessarily loved those, but because they felt that was the only place where they could do the cutting edge research. Sometimes they needed the money because they made huge debts going to Stanford, which is, more expensive than I think any European university is. So the incentives need to change, but the most important thing is that this gets political priority and that there is an understanding of how important technology is in our society, that it's really now the infrastructure upon which our lives run, whether it's our intimate romantic lives, whether it is the lives of our kids at school, whether it is the way we organize tax and government, whether it is our national security. I mean, tell me any product, service sector that is not impacted by tech, and then look at how we've organized the whole thing and how that relates to core principles that we believe in here in Europe. And you'll see huge disconnects in many places, and I think that needs to be rebalanced.
One final question. If you have to look at something in 1 year from now, that is the most important thing that could happen, that is happening in this tension between democratic politics and the big tech industrial complex, what would you point to? What is the most important thing we should look at?
Well, let's do two things. I'll focus on one in the private sector, which I think is the AI bubble. So, speculation is now not so much whether the AI bubble will burst, but when. And I think there will probably be catastrophic economic consequences, but it will hopefully also lead to an opening of rethinking some of the dogma that we find in talk about AI, that leads to people wanting AI without knowing why or what it is. And that leads to an imbalance in how we treat the tech companies and the technology itself, how much adoption we tolerate, how much risk we tolerate. So the bubble is one thing. The second is public procurement in Europe. I think that governments are not using one of the most powerful tools that they have, which is to lead by example and spend differently. And, you know, just to be clear, this is not about being anti-American at all. This is about appreciating that this president has a lot of power, like every president does, and he has shown he's willing to use it in unprecedented ways, including vis-a-vis Europe, including vis-a-vis democratically established laws and oversight policies, and that this could escalate to a more weaponized use of our dependence, right? And the weaponization of our dependence. And this risk in and of itself is something that Europeans should want to lower. And government spending is a key lever because it would show the way, it would give signals to the market, and it would align the public institutions with the public spending and the public interest tech that would be European. I also don't want to imply that all European companies are angels, but at least there's less risk of them becoming tools in the hands of hegemonic powers that are not friendly to our interests right now.
So you're basically proposing a buy-European tech procurement. So decoupling from the US big tech industry.
Indeed.
Okay,
Yep.
that's a quite bold proposal, and I think it's a good place to end because I know that you are very busy. So let me just show again the cover of the Italian version of your book, even if our conversation is in English, but I will publish also an Italian translation. So thank you so much, Marietje Schaake, for your time and for this great book that I think it's extremely needed because we need radical ideas to tackle these enormous problems. I mean, the usual, the business as a usual approach is sometimes the most dangerous one. Okay.
That's right. Thank you so much, Stefano. This was really a pleasure.
Thank you again.
Ciao. Arrivederci.
Okay.